You really thought you could erase us, didn't you, Grant? The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence of the cathedral like a knife. The bride Tiffany didn't gasp. She threw her head back and laughed, a cruel, piercing sound that echoed off the stained glass. She thought it was a pathetic attempt at extortion. She thought she had won. But she didn't know that the envelope in the woman's hand didn't contain a lawsuit for money. It contained a birth certificate, a timeline, and a DNA test that was about to turn this fairy tale wedding into a nightmare. Grant wasn't just a liar. He was a father, and his past had just walked in the front door. The air inside the St. Regis ballroom smelled of imported white hydrangeas and old money. It was the kind of wedding where the napkins were silk and the security guards wore earpieces that cost more than most people's cars. Grant sat at the head table, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke tuxedo. He looked out at the sea of faces, 300 of the city's elite. There were senators, tech moguls, and socialites all there to witness the union of Grant Miller and Tiffany St. James. To the outside world, Grant was the ultimate success story. A self-made venture capitalist who had pulled himself out of a modest upbringing in Ohio to become a major player in New York real estate. He was charming, he was handsome, and he was 34 years old, with a smile that could disarm a hostile board meeting. But to Tiffany, he was a trophy. Tiffany Street. James was the only daughter of Robert Street James, an oil tycoon whose net worth required 10 digits to calculate. Tiffany was beautiful, yes, but in a sharp, angular way. She had icy blonde hair, eyes that constantly scanned the room for someone more important to talk to, and a laugh that sounded like coins dropping into a slot machine. "Stop fidgeting, darling," Tiffany whispered, leaning over to brush a speck of invisible dust off Grant's lapel. Her voice was sugary sweet, but her grip on his arm was tight. "The photographer is taking candid shots. Try to look like you own the place." "I'm just taking it in," Grant lied smoothly, flashing his signature grin. "It's a perfect day." "It is," she agreed, taking a sip of her champagne. "Daddy spent $4 million on it. It better be perfect." Grant's eyes flickered to the back of the room, where his new father-in-law Robert was holding court. Grant had worked hard for this. For 5 years he had scrubbed his life clean. He had changed his phone number, deleted his old social media, and ghosted everyone from his past life in Columbus. He had reinvented himself as a man with no baggage, no debts, and no attachments. When he met Tiffany 2 years ago, he told her he was an orphan. It was a lie that elicited sympathy, and more importantly, stopped her from asking to meet his family. "To the happy couple," a groomsman shouted, raising a glass. Grant raised his own, feeling the cold crystal against his palm. He had done it. He had married into the St. James dynasty. Tomorrow, his name would be on the deed to the penthouse in Tribeca. Next week, Robert was signing over a seat on the board of St. James Energy. He was safe. He was richish, he was untouchable. Or so he thought. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom, which had been closed and guarded by security, suddenly creaked open. It wasn't a violent entrance. It was slow, deliberate. The light from the hallway spilled in, creating a silhouette. The chatter in the room didn't stop immediately, but it rippled into silence as people turned to look. The security guard, a massive man named Tiny, stepped forward to block the intruder, but then he paused. The woman walking in didn't look like a crasher. She was wearing a dress the color of spilled wine, a deep, rich burgundy that hugged a figure that had clearly seen the inside of a gym. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant chignon. She walked with a confidence that made the socialites in the room feel suddenly underdressed. Grant dropped his champagne glass. It hit the table but didn't break, rolling onto the floor and soaking the tablecloth. "Grant!" Tiffany snapped, annoyed. "What are you doing?" But Grant couldn't hear her. All the blood had drained from his face. He felt like he was falling from a great height. He knew that walk. He knew those eyes. It was Rachel. The silence in the room was now absolute. The only sound was the clicking of Rachel's heels on the marble floor. Click, click, click. It sounded like the countdown on a bomb. Rachel stopped 10 feet from the head table. She didn't look crazy. She didn't look like the weeping, broken woman Grant had left behind in a one-bedroom apartment in Ohio 5 years ago. She looked terrifyingly composed. Tiffany stood up, her expensive lace dress rustling. She didn't look threatened. She looked amused. She scanned Rachel up and down, taking in the dress, the shoes, the lack of jewelry. "Excuse me." Tiffany's voice rang out sharp and entitled. "I think you're in the wrong room. The staff entrance is around the back." A few guests chuckled nervously. Rachel didn't look at Tiffany. Her gaze was locked on Grant. Her eyes were dark, burning with a cold fire. "Hello, Grant," Rachel said. Her voice was steady, calm. Grant tried to speak, but his throat was dry. "Rachel, what are you doing here?" Tiffany looked between them, her eyebrows shooting up. "Wait. You know this person?" She turned to Grant, a smirk playing on her lips. "Let me guess. An old fling." "A college stalker." Grant stood up, his legs shaking. He had to get her out of here. He had to stop this before Robert St. James figured out who she was. "Rachel, this isn't the time. You need to leave. We can talk later." "We're done talking, Grant," Rachel said, reaching into her clutch. Tiffany stepped forward, placing a possessive hand on Grant's chest. She looked at Rachel with pure, unadulterated pity. "Oh, I get it," Tiffany said, letting out a laugh. It started as a giggle and escalated into a full-blown cackle. She looked at her guests, gesturing to Rachel. "Look at this." It's the classic ex-girlfriend crashes the wedding cliché. "How much do you want, honey? Did you see the announcement in the Times and decide to try for a payout?" Tiffany opened her own purse, a diamond-encrusted clutch, and pulled out a checkbook. She waved it in the air like a weapon. "Is 10,000 enough?" Tiffany mocked, uncapping a pen. "I'll write you a check right now if you turn around and walk out. Consider it a severance package for whatever cheap fling you two had." Grant was sweating now. "Tiffany, don't—" "Quiet, Grant. I handled charity cases," Tiffany sneered. She scribbled on the check, ripped it out, and flicked it toward Rachel. The paper fluttered through the air and landed near Rachel's feet. "Pick it up," Tiffany commanded, her voice dropping to a growl. "Take the money. Buy yourself a better dress, and get out of my sight." The room was tense. Robert St. James was watching from his table, his eyes narrowed. He didn't like scenes, but he liked seeing his daughter assert dominance even less. Rachel looked down at the check. Then she looked up at Tiffany, and for the first time she smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a hunter who had just watched the prey step into the trap. "You can keep your money, Tiffany," Rachel said softly. "I don't need it. I own a software firm in Chicago. I probably made more this morning than you've earned in your entire life." The smile vanished from Tiffany's face. "I'm not here for money," Rachel continued, her voice rising so the back of the room could hear. "And I'm not here to get him back. You can have him. I'm just here to drop off something Grant forgot." "Forgot," Grant whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. Rachel pulled a large manila envelope from her bag. She didn't throw it. She walked forward and placed it gently on the table right next to the wedding cake. "You forgot to say goodbye, Grant," Rachel said. And you forgot to tell your new wife why you really left Ohio." Grant stared at the envelope. He knew what was inside, even though he had spent 5 years pretending it didn't exist. "Security!" Tiffany shrieked, her patience gone. "Get her out of here. Now!" 2 guards started moving toward the table, but Robert St. James stood up. "Wait," the older man commanded. His voice was like gravel. He walked toward the head table, his gaze fixed on Grant. "What did you forget, Grant?" "Nothing, Robert. She's crazy," Grant stammered, grabbing the envelope. "She's just a jealous ex. I'll handle this." He tried to shove the envelope into his jacket pocket, but his hands were shaking so badly he dropped it. The contents spilled out. Photographs. Dozens of them. They scattered across the white tablecloth. Tiffany looked down. Her eyes widened. She reached out and picked up a 5x7 glossy photo. It wasn't a picture of Grant and Rachel. It was a picture of 2 children, a boy and a girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old. They had dark, curly hair and bright blue eyes. Grant's eyes. Tiffany stared at the photo, then at Grant. The resemblance was undeniable. The boy had Grant's chin. The girl had his nose. "Who are these?" Tiffany asked, her voice barely a whisper. The mockery was gone, replaced by confusion. "They're his children," Rachel said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Ethan and Chloe. They just turned 5 last week." A collective gasp went through the room. "Liar!" Grant shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "She's lying! I've never seen those kids in my life." Rachel reached into the pile on the table and held up a document. "This is a paternity test court-ordered in the state of Ohio 3 years ago. You didn't show up for the hearing, Grant, so the judge ruled in my favor by default. But just to be sure, I hired a private investigator to snag that coffee cup you threw away at the Starbucks on 5th Avenue last week." She tossed the document toward Robert St. James. The older man caught it, put on his reading glasses and scanned the page. 99.99% probability. Robert read aloud, his voice cold. "He left when I was 3 months pregnant." Rachel addressed the crowd, turning her back on Grant. "He said he was going to pick up dinner. He emptied our joint bank account, all $6,000 of our savings, and never came back. I called the police. I called hospitals. I thought he was dead." She turned back to Tiffany, whose face was now pale as the hydrangeas. "He wasn't dead, Tiffany. He was here, climbing the social ladder, telling you he was an orphan." Rachel took a step closer to the bride. "You laughed when I walked in. You thought I was trash. But tell me who is the real trash. The single mother who built a company while raising twins alone, or the man standing next to you who hasn't sent a single birthday card in 5 years?" Tiffany looked at Grant. She looked like she was seeing a stranger. "Grant," she asked, her voice trembling, "is this true? You told me your parents died in a car crash. You said you had no family." It's complicated, Tiff," Grant pleaded, reaching for her hand. "I was young. I was scared. I didn't know she was pregnant when I left." "Another lie," Rachel interrupted. She pulled a piece of paper from her pocket, a crumpled, yellowing note. "This is the note you left on the kitchen counter. I can't do this, Rachel. I'm not ready to be a father. Don't look for me." She held it up for the cameras that were now zooming in. "You knew, Grant. You knew exactly what you were leaving behind." Robert St. James looked up from the paternity test. His face was purple with rage. He had built his empire on reputation, on the concept of family legacy. "You have children," Robert boomed, "and you hid them. You married my daughter under false pretenses." "Robert, please, I can explain." Grant said, backing away, as the older man advanced. I did it for us. I wanted to be worthy of Tiffany. I knew you wouldn't accept a guy with baggage. Baggage, Rachel said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Is that what you call them? Baggage? She pulled out her phone. Would you like to see a video of the baggage crying on their birthday because their daddy didn't come home? Stop it, Grant screamed. Just stop. I'm not done, Rachel said. And neither is the law. The doors at the back of the room opened again. This time it wasn't a woman in a red dress. It was 2 uniformed police officers and a man in a sharp grey suit holding a briefcase. Grant Miller, the man in the suit called out. I'm Detective Harrison. We have a warrant for your arrest. Grant Miller had always prided himself on his ability to talk his way out of anything. He had charmed investors out of millions and seduced an heiress into marriage. But as Detective Harrison marched across the ballroom floor, Grant realized that charm doesn't work on handcuffs. Arrest? Grant laughed nervously, looking at Robert. Robert, tell them. This is a misunderstanding. It's a prank, right part of the reception entertainment. Robert St. James didn't even blink. He poured himself a glass of whiskey from the table, took a sip, and sat down. He looked like a king watching an execution. I don't think this is entertainment, Grant, Robert said calmly. And if it is, the reviews are going to be terrible. Detective Harrison reached the table. He was a man who looked like he had seen everything and was impressed by none of it. Grant Miller, also known as Greg Milburn. He began reciting the words from memory. You are under arrest for grand larceny wire fraud and identity theft. Identity theft, Tiffany gasped, her hand flying to her throat. That's right, Ma'am, the detective said, glancing at the bride. The man you're marrying isn't Grant Miller. The real Grant Miller died in a boating accident in 2015. This man, he gestured to the groom, is Greg Milburn. He stole the identity of his deceased college roommate to wipe his credit history clean after he fled Ohio. The room erupted. The whisper broke into a roar. You stole a dead man's name, Rachel asked, her voice cutting through the noise. She looked at him with a mix of horror and vindication. I knew you were a liar, Greg, but I didn't know you were a ghoul. It was a fresh start, Grant knew. Greg screamed, his facade finally cracking. His face twisted into something ugly and desperate. I did what I had to do. I was drowning in debt. I had a kid on the way. I couldn't breathe. So you suffocated us instead, Rachel shot back. Turn around. Hands behind your back, Harrison ordered. No, you can't do this. I'm a St. James, Greg yelled, looking wildly at his new wife. Tiffany, tell them we're married. I have rights. I have access to the family lawyers. Tiffany stared at him. The man she had loved for 2 years, the man she had planned a future with, was dissolving before her eyes. She looked at the check she had thrown at Rachel earlier, still lying on the floor. She looked at the photos of the children who had her husband's eyes. She picked up her glass of champagne. Actually, Tiffany said, her voice ice-cold, the priest hasn't signed the license yet. It's sitting right there on the altar. Greg's eyes widened. He lunged toward the altar, where the official documents lay waiting for the final signature. Sign it. Somebody sign it. Tiny. The massive security guard stepped in Grant's path. He didn't say a word. He just crossed his arms. Tiffany, please, Greg begged, as the officer grabbed his wrist and snapped the metal cuff shut. Click. I love you. Everything I did to get it to you. You didn't do it for me, Tiffany said. Tears finally spilling over cutting tracks through her flawless makeup. You did it for the money. You did it for the penthouse. You're just a con man in a tuxedo. Take him away. Robert St. James barked. As the police dragged him out, Greg Milburn, the man who would be king of New York, was kicking and screaming like a child. The guests held up their phones, live-streaming the downfall. The flashbulbs that were meant to capture the wedding of the century were now capturing the mugshot of the year. When the heavy doors finally slammed shut, the silence returned. But it wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. Rachel stood alone in the center of the dance floor. She didn't look triumphant. She looked exhausted. She picked up her bag, smoothed her dress, and turned to leave. "Wait," Tiffany called out. 10 minutes later, the ballroom was empty of guests. Robert had ordered everyone out, promising refunds on gifts and threatening legal action if anyone posted the videos a hollow threat, as the videos were already viral. In the private bridal suite, Tiffany sat on a velvet sofa, still in her $50,000 gown. She had ripped the veil off her head and thrown it into the corner. Her mascara was smeared, and she was drinking whiskey straight from the bottle. Rachel sat opposite her in a chair, her posture perfect. She hadn't touched the water Robert had offered her. "So," Tiffany said, her voice raspy, "you have twins. Ethan and Chloe." Rachel nodded. "They're good kids. They think their dad is an astronaut on a long mission. I'm going to have to come up with a new story now." "Tell them he's in prison," Tiffany said bitterly. "It's closer to the truth." Robert St. James paced the room, his phone glued to his ear as he barked orders to his PR team. "Kill the story. I don't care what it costs. Yes, annulment. Immediate." He hung up and looked at Rachel. "Miss, I didn't catch your last name," Robert said. "Bennett," Rachel said. "Rachel Bennett." "Ms. Bennett," Robert sighed, rubbing his temples. "You have caused quite a mess today, but you also saved my family from a catastrophic mistake. If that man had gained access to my accounts," he shuddered, "I owe you a debt." "I didn't do it for you," Rachel said firmly. "I did it because he stopped paying the hush money." Tiffany's head snapped up. "Hush money?" Rachel reached into her bag again. "For the last 2 years since he made it in New York, he's been sending me $5,000 a month, anonymously. Cash in the mail, no return address, just a note that said, 'Stay away.'" "He was paying you off?" Tiffany asked. "Yes, but last month the payment stopped," Rachel explained. "I didn't care about the money, I make my own. But then I got a letter. It wasn't from him. It was a legal notice, a cease and desist, threatening to sue me for harassment if I ever contacted Grant Miller. He was trying to legally erase me before the wedding so I couldn't claim spousal support or challenge the marriage." Rachel leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Tiffany's. "That letter scared me. Not for myself, but for my kids. If he was willing to use lawyers to threaten a mother he hadn't seen in 5 years, what would he do when the kids got older? What if they tried to find him? I had to stop him before he got too powerful to touch." Tiffany looked down at her hands. The diamond engagement ring, a 4-carat emerald cut, felt heavy and grotesque on her finger. She yanked it off and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud. "He told me he bought that with his bonus," Tiffany whispered. "He probably bought it with money he embezzled." "Ms. Bennett," Robert interrupted, pulling a checkbook from his jacket. "I know you said you don't need money, but I insist. For the children. A college fund. 500,000. Rachel looked at the checkbook, then at Robert. "I don't want your money, Mr. St. James. I want something else." "Name it," Robert said. "I want his rights terminated." Rachel said, her voice hard as steel. "I want full legal custody. I want a restraining order so tight that if he even looks at a map of Ohio, he goes back to jail. And I want you to help me get it. You have the best lawyers in the country. I want them on my side." Robert smiled a genuine, shark-like smile. He respected ruthlessness. "Consider it done. My lead counsel, Mr. Sterling, will meet you in the morning. We will bury him under so much paperwork, he won't see the sun for a decade." Tiffany stood up. She walked over to Rachel. The two women, one in bridal white and one in blood red, stood toe to toe. "I laughed at you," Tiffany said softly. "I called you a charity case. I'm sorry." Rachel looked at the younger woman. She saw the pain behind the arrogance. "You were a victim too, Tiffany. He conned us both. He just conned me first." "I'm going to testify," Tiffany said, wiping her eyes. "If he stole an identity, he committed fraud. If he signed a marriage license, even if it wasn't finalized under a false name, that's perjury. I have emails. I have texts where he talks about his past. I can prove he knew what he was doing." Rachel nodded. "Then let's finish him." 3 months later. The trial of the People versus Gregory Milburn was the most talked about event in New York. The tabloids called him the Groom of Doom. Rachel sat in the front row of the courtroom, wearing a navy blue suit. Next to her was Tiffany. The two of them had formed a strange symbiotic friendship. They met for coffee once a week. Tiffany had even started a charity for single mothers, a way to atone for her behavior at the wedding. In the defendant's chair, Greg looked like a shadow of the man he used to be. The prison haircut didn't suit him. His expensive tan had faded to a sickly gray. He refused to look at the gallery. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Mrs. Alvarez, was walking the jury through the timeline. "The defendant didn't just leave a pregnant girlfriend," Alvarez said, pacing in front of the jury box. "He orchestrated a complete disappearance. He faked a suicide note in his car near the Ohio River to stop the police from looking for him. He then moved to Chicago, where he met the real Grant Miller. When Mr. Miller died in a tragic accident, the defendant saw an opportunity." Alvarez projected a slide on the screen. It was a bank statement. "He drained the real Grant Miller's accounts. He used that money to move to New York. He forged transcripts from Yale. He built a house of lies on a foundation of theft." Then came the star witness. The prosecution calls Tiffany St. James to the stand. Tiffany walked up the aisle. She looked modest, wearing a simple black dress. She took the oath and sat down. "Ms. St. James," Alvarez asked, "when did you realize your fiancé was a fraud?" "The moment Rachel Bennett walked into the ballroom," Tiffany said clearly. "Did the defendant ever mention his children to you?" "Never." "He told me he was sterile," Tiffany revealed. A gasp went through the courtroom. Rachel's head snapped up. She hadn't known that part. "He used it to gain my sympathy. He said he wanted to adopt eventually. It was all part of the act to make sure I never worried about birth control or questioned why no family ever visited." "And did he ask you for money?" "Constantly," Tiffany said. "Small amounts at first, investment opportunities. Then larger amounts, a bridge loan for a property, a deposit for a yacht. In total, I transferred him nearly $2 million of my personal trust fund." Greg's lawyer, a court-appointed attorney who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, stood up. "Objection. Relevance." "It goes to the pattern of behavior, Your Honor," Alvarez shot back. "He strips women of their assets and their dignity, then moves on." "Overruled," the judge said. Tiffany looked directly at Greg. For the first time, he looked back. He mouthed the words, "I loved you." Tiffany leaned into the microphone. "He is a parasite," she stated for the record, and he picked the wrong host. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA test. The financial records, the testimony of the real Grant Miller's grieving mother, who had been wondering why her dead son's credit card was being used in Manhattan. But the final twist came during the sentencing hearing. Greg had pleaded guilty to lesser charges in hopes of a deal, but the judge wasn't having it. However, before the gavel could bang down, Greg stood up. "I have something to say," Greg announced. The judge peered over his glasses. "Make it quick, Mr. Milburn." "I have assets," Greg said, his voice trembling. "Hidden assets. Crypto. Offshore accounts. I can pay it all back. The $2 million to Tiffany. The child support to Rachel. I have nearly $5 million stashed away." The courtroom went silent. Even Rachel was stunned. $5 million. "I'll give up the keys to the accounts," Greg bargained, looking desperate. "If you give me probation, I can pay everyone back. I just want to see my kids. I want to be a father." He turned to Rachel, tears streaming down his face. "Rachel, please, for Ethan and Chloe. Don't let their dad rot in a cell. Let me buy their future." It was a compelling offer. $5 million would change Rachel's life. It would secure the twins' future forever. It was enough to make anyone pause. The judge looked at Rachel. "Ms. Bennett, as the primary victim of the abandonment charge, the court is interested in your stance." Rachel stood up slowly. She looked at the man who had left her sleeping with a note on the counter. She thought about the nights she held 2 crying babies, wondering how she would pay for diapers. She thought about the $5 million. She took a deep breath. "Keep your money, Greg," Rachel said, her voice ringing out like a bell. "What?" Greg stunned. "My children are not for sale," she continued, "and neither is my forgiveness. You think money fixes this? You think you can buy 5 years of missed birthdays? You think you can buy the memory of me waking up alone?" She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, if he has $5 million, it's stolen money. Seize it. Give it to the victims of his other scams. But do not give me a dime if it means letting him walk free. I would rather raise my children in a shack than have them know their father bought his freedom with blood money." Tiffany stood up next to her. "And I don't want it either. Lock him up." The judge nodded, a rare look of respect on his face. "Gregory Milburn," the judge said, "it seems your credit is no good here." The fluorescent lights of the Manhattan Criminal Court buzzed with a low, headache-inducing hum that seemed to vibrate against the inside of Rachel Bennett's skull. It was day 14 of the trial. Outside, a winter storm was battering New York City. Sleet hitting the high windows like handfuls of gravel, but inside the atmosphere was stiflingly hot. The courtroom was packed. Every bench was filled with reporters, curious onlookers, and the high society friends of the St. James family, who had come to watch the final act of the tragedy. They were vultures, Rachel thought here, to pick the bones of a reputation. She sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. To her left sat Tiffany St. James. Over the last few weeks, the distance between them had closed physically and emotionally. At the wedding, they had been enemies, standing on opposite sides of a lie. Now they were soldiers in the same trench. Tiffany looked tired. Her usual pristine posture slumped slightly. The dark circles under her eyes, visible even through the layer of expensive concealer. At the defense table, Gregory Milburn, the man they had both known as Grant Miller, sat alone. He looked smaller than Rachel remembered. The Italian suits were gone, replaced by a generic, ill-fitting grey blazer provided by his public defender. His hair, usually styled to perfection, was thinning and dull. He wasn't looking at the judge. He was looking at the gallery, his eyes darting back and forth, desperately seeking eye contact with anyone who might offer a sympathetic nod. When his eyes met Rachel's, he offered a weak, trembling smile. Rachel didn't smile back. She didn't feel anger anymore. She just felt a heavy, leaden exhaustion. She wanted this to be over. She wanted to go home to Ohio to her twins, to a life where her name wasn't in the New York Post. "All rise!" The bailiff bellowed his voice, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Judge Patterson swept into the room. He was a man of few words and severe expression, known in legal circles as the Hammer. He adjusted his robes, sat down, and peered over his wire-rimmed spectacles at the defendant. "Be seated," the judge said. The rustling of fabric filled the room as 200 people sat down in unison. "Mr. Milburn," Judge Patterson began, his voice dry and devoid of emotion. "We have heard 2 weeks of testimony. We have seen financial records that map out a labyrinth of deceit spanning 3 states and 5 years. We have heard from victims who lost their retirement savings to your investment opportunities. But most damning of all, we have heard from the 2 women sitting in the front row." Greg stood up. His hands were shaking so badly he had to grip the table to steady himself. "Your Honor," Greg interrupted, his voice cracking. "If I may." The judge paused, his eyes narrowing. "You have had your turn to speak, Mr. Milburn. But since you seem eager, I will allow a final statement. Make it brief." Greg took a deep breath. He turned slightly, angling his body so he was facing both the judge and the cameras at the back of the room. He was still performing, Rachel realized. He still thought he was the protagonist of this story. "I know what I did looks bad." Greg started flashing a charming, boyish grin that felt grotesque in the fluorescent light. "I made mistakes. I got in over my head. But everything I did it for love. I wanted to be the man Tiffany deserved. I wanted to build a future so secure that my children, Rachel's children, would never have to worry about money." He looked at Rachel, tears welling up in his eyes on cue. "Rachel, you know me. You know I'm not a bad person. I was scared. I was a coward. But I'm not a criminal. I have assets. I told the court I have nearly $5 million in offshore accounts. I can pay everyone. Wir back. I can make this right. Please don't take a father away from his kids." A hush fell over the room. $5 million. It was a staggering amount of money. Rachel could feel the eyes of the jury shifting. Money had a way of softening sins. If he could pay it back. Was it really a crime? Judge Patterson let the silence hang in the air for a long, agonizing minute. He picked up a sheaf of papers from his desk, the pre-sentencing report. $5 million, the judge repeated. That is indeed a significant sum. Greg nodded eagerly. "Yes, Your Honor. It's all there, in the Cayman Islands. I'll give you the access keys. Just give me probation. Let me work to pay off my debts." The judge looked at Rachel. "Ms. Bennett, as the mother of the children in question and a victim of his initial abandonment, the court would like to hear your position on this offer." Rachel stood up. Her legs felt heavy, but her mind was clear. She walked to the railing. She didn't look at Greg. She looked only at the judge. "Your Honor," Rachel said, her voice steady. 5 years ago, this man left me with $6 in a checking account and 2 heartbeats on a sonogram. I worked 3 jobs, I skipped meals so my babies could have formula. I built a life from the ashes he left behind. She paused, taking a breath. He offers $5 million now, but he doesn't tell you that the money is stolen. It belongs to the elderly couple in Chicago he scammed in 2018. It belongs to the small business owners in Delaware he defrauded in 2019. It belongs to Tiffany Street James. She turned to face Greg for the first time. You can't buy fatherhood, Greg. You can't buy the birthdays you missed. You can't buy the nights I held a sick child alone, praying the fever would break. You think that money makes you a father. That money is just proof that you value currency over character. I don't want your money. And my children certainly don't need a father who thinks he can purchase their love. She turned back to the judge. If you let him buy his way out of this, you aren't giving my children a father. You're teaching them that the law has a price tag. Rachel sat down. Her heart was pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Next to her, Tiffany stood up. She didn't go to the railing. She just stood at her seat, tall and imposing. I concur with Ms. Bennett, Tiffany said, her voice icy. Keep the money. Keep him. Judge Patterson nodded slowly. He looked back at Greg, whose hopeful expression was beginning to crumble into panic. The court rejects the defendant's request for leniency based on restitution, Patterson ruled. Furthermore, regarding the $5 million in offshore assets, the court orders the immediate seizure of these funds under the federal civil asset forfeiture laws. They will be placed in a victim compensation fund. You can't do that, Greg screamed, lunging forward. That's my leverage. That's my money. It is not your money, Mr. Milburn. It never was, the judge snapped. He banged his gavel, a sound that rang out like a gunshot. Gregory Milburn, please rise for sentencing. Two bailiffs moved in close behind Greg. He stood, shaking violently. On the count of grand larceny in the first degree, I sentence you to 10 years in a state correctional facility, the judge read. Greg let out a sob. On the count of identity theft, 5 years. On the count of wire fraud, 10 years. On the count of bigamy, 2 years. The judge looked over his glasses. These sentences are to run consecutively, not concurrently. You created a separate life for each of these crimes. Therefore, you will serve a separate sentence for each. Consecutively. Greg gasped, the math hitting him like a physical blow. That's 27 years. Your Honor, please, I'll be an old man. You should have thought of that before you decided to play God with people's lives, Patterson said, closing the file. Bail is revoked. The defendant is remanded to custody immediately. Tiffany! Greg shrieked, turning around as the bailiffs grabbed his arms. He looked wild, his eyes wide and white. Tiffany, help me. Call your dad. Call the governor. I love you. I did it for us. Tiffany didn't move. She watched him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen in a jar. Rachel! Greg yelled as they dragged him toward the side door. Tell the kids. Tell them I tried. Tell them I love them. They don't know who you are, Rachel whispered to herself, too quiet for him to hear. The heavy steel door slammed shut, cutting off his screams. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the residue of destroyed lives. Then from the back of the room, someone started clapping. Then another. It wasn't a thunderous applause, just a slow, steady rhythm of approval. Robert St. James, sitting 2 rows back, leaned forward and placed a hand on Tiffany's shoulder. It's done, darling. He's gone. Tiffany let out a long, shuddering breath and leaned into her father's hand. She looked at Rachel. Are you okay? Tiffany asked. Rachel looked at the empty defense table. For 5 years, She had been running from a ghost. She had been looking over her shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Now the ghost was locked in a cage. "I think," Rachel said, a genuine smile breaking across her face, "I'm finally free." 24 hours later. The media frenzy outside the courthouse had been intense, but Robert St. James's private security team had whisked them away through an underground loading dock. Now the silence of Tiffany's penthouse apartment in Tribeca felt almost deafening. It was the same penthouse Greg had bragged about buying. The irony was that the deed had always been in Tiffany's name. Greg had just been a guest in her life, in every sense of the word. Rachel stood on the balcony, looking out at the glittering skyline of Manhattan. The city looked beautiful from up here, detached and peaceful. The glass door slid open, and Tiffany stepped out, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. She was wearing sweatpants and an oversized hoodie, clothes the old Tiffany wouldn't have been caught dead in. "Here," Tiffany said, handing her a mug. "I put a shot of Bailey's in it. I figured we earned it." "Thanks," Rachel said, wrapping her hands around the warmth. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the traffic below. "So," Tiffany said, leaning against the railing. "What now?" "You go back to Ohio." "I have to," Rachel said. "I have a company to run, and the twins, they need normalcy. They need to get back to school." "I was thinking," Tiffany said hesitantly. "My dad, he's been talking to his lawyers. He wants to set up a trust for Ethan and Chloe. Education, healthcare, whatever they need. He feels responsible. He introduced Greg to half the people he scammed." Rachel shook her head. "Tiffany, we talked about this. I don't need charity." "It's not charity, Rachel. It's penance," Tiffany said sharply. Then she softened. "Look, my dad is a shark. He's not a nice man, but he values family above everything. And strangely enough, he considers you and those kids family now. You're the only ones who told him the truth. Everyone else in his life just kisses his ring." Rachel sighed. She thought about the cost of college. She thought about the uncertain economy. "I'll accept it on one condition," Rachel said. "Name it. You have to be the trustee. You control it. And you have to come visit us in Ohio at least twice a year to check on your investment." Tiffany laughed, a real throaty laugh that sounded nothing like the tinkling fake laugh she had used at the wedding. "Deal. But I'm warning you, I don't do camping. If I visit Ohio, I'm staying at the Ritz." "We don't have a Ritz, Tiff. We have a Holiday Inn Express." "Lord help me," Tiffany groaned. They clinked their mugs together. It was a toast to the end of an era and the beginning of a strange, beautiful friendship, forged in the fire of betrayal. 5 years later, time has a way of smoothing out even the jaggedest edges. The first year was the hardest. Rachel had to testify at 3 more hearings regarding the seizure of assets. Tiffany had to endure the public humiliation of the divorce proceedings and the endless tabloid headlines, the runaway groom and the billionaire bride. But by year 3, the headlines stopped. People moved on to new scandals. And by year 5, Gregory Milburn was just a name in an old file. It was a crisp October afternoon in Columbus, Ohio. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of orange and gold, covering the sprawling backyard of Rachel's new home. It wasn't a mansion, but it was a beautiful, sturdy Victorian house with a wraparound porch and a tire swing in the oak tree. Rachel sat on the porch swing, a laptop balanced on her knees. Her software company, SecurePath, had just signed a contract with the Department of Defense. She wasn't just doing well. She was wealthy in her own right now. "Mom, watch this." Rachel looked up. Ethan, now 10 years old and lanky, was hanging upside down from the tire swing. Chloe was pushing him, laughing maniacally. "Careful, you maniacs," Rachel called out, smiling. A sleek black town car pulled into the gravel driveway. This was a rare sight in their quiet suburban neighborhood. The neighbors usually peeked through their curtains when it arrived. The driver opened the back door, and out stepped Tiffany Street James. She looked radiant. She wore a tailored camel coat and designer boots, but her face was softer, happier. She carried a Whole Foods bag in one arm and a massive Lego set in the other. Behind her, moving slower, but with no less dignity, was Robert St. James. He used a cane, now his hair completely white, but his eyes were sharp. "Aunt Tiff, Grandpa, Rob." The twins abandoned the swing and sprinted toward the car. Rachel closed her laptop and walked down the steps to greet them. "You're late?" Rachel teased as she hugged Tiffany. "Traffic on the I-70 was a nightmare," Tiffany complained, though she was smiling, "and Dad insisted we stop at some roadside stand for apple butter." "It's artisanal," Robert defended himself, handing Rachel a jar. "Good to see you, Rachel." "You too, Robert." They moved into the kitchen, which was filled with the smell of roasting chicken. It had become a tradition. Every few months, the St. James clan would fly down on their private jet, rent a car, and play Suburban Family for the weekend. While the kids dragged Robert into the living room to show him their report cards, Robert paid $100 for every a bribery scheme Rachel had tried and failed to stop Tiffany, and Rachel chopped vegetables at the island. "I saw him," Tiffany said quietly, slicing a cucumber with unnecessary force. Rachel stopped stirring the gravy. She didn't have to ask who. "How is he?" "Old," Tiffany said. "I went to the parole hearing last week, just to stand in the back. He looks hollow. He tried to speak, tried to give that old charm, but nobody was buying it. The board denied him in 5 minutes. And then—" Tiffany paused, putting down the knife. "Then the state prosecutors dropped the new hammer," she continued. "Tax evasion charges from 2016. They found another account he hadn't declared. They added 8 years to his sentence." Rachel did the math in her head. "He won't be out until the twins are nearly 20. "He'll be 62 years old," Tiffany said. "He'll have nothing. No money, no friend, woman's, no family. He'll just be an old man with a record." Rachel looked out the window. Ethan was showing Robert how to play a video game on the TV. Chloe was braiding the tassels on the throw rug. They were happy. They were safe. They were loved. "Does he ask about them?" Rachel asked. "He tried to give me a letter for you," Tiffany said. She reached into her purse and pulled out a plain white envelope. It was wrinkled. "The guard let me take it. I told him I'd deliver it." Rachel wiped her hands on a dish towel and took the envelope. It felt light. Rachel Bennett was scrawled on the front in handwriting that looked shaky desperate. For a moment, the old fear flared up. The voice in the back of her head that said he still had power over her, that his words could still hurt. "Do you want to read it?" Tiffany asked softly. "It might be an apology, or a beg for money, or just more lies." Rachel looked at the letter. She thought about the man who wrote it. She tried to conjure up his face, but it was blurry now, overlaid by the faces of the people currently in her kitchen, the people who had actually shown up. "No," Rachel said. "I don't think I do." "What do you want to do with it?" Rachel walked over to the gas stove. She clicked the burner on. A ring of blue fire flared to life. "I think," Rachel said, holding the corner of the envelope over the flame, "I want to make space for dessert." The paper caught instantly. The orange flame curled around the edges, turning the white paper to black ash. Rachel held it until the heat nipped at her fingertips, then dropped it into the metal sink. They watched it burn, the words inside whatever lies, whatever pleas, whatever manipulations turned to smoke and were sucked up the ventilation hood. "Gone?" Tiffany whispered. "Gone," Rachel agreed. She turned off the burner and washed the ash down the drain with a spray of water. She turned back to Tiffany, her eyes bright. "Now, did you bring that expensive wine you promised, or do I have to open the grocery store stuff?" Tiffany grinned, the tension breaking. "Please, it's a vintage Cabernet. It cost more than my first car." "Perfect." Rachel walked into the living room. "Okay, everyone, dinner is in 10 minutes. Wash up." "Oh, Mom," Ethan groaned. "Do as your mother says," Robert commanded, struggling to get up from the deep sofa. "And afterwards I want a rematch on that Mario Kart game. I refuse to be beaten by a 10-year-old. "I'm going to destroy you, Grandpa," Chloe giggled. Rachel stood in the doorway watching them. This was her family. It wasn't the traditional family she had dreamed of as a little girl. It was messy and weird, and born out of a disaster. But it was real. Greg Milburn was sitting in a 6-by-8 cell, staring at a concrete wall, holding on to memories of a life he had thrown away. Rachel Bennett was standing in a warm home, surrounded by laughter, holding a glass of wine poured by her best friend. She raised the glass to the ceiling, a silent toast to the universe. "You lose, Greg." She took a sip, and it tasted like victory. And that is the story of how one man's house of lies came crashing down. Greg thought he could trade people like stocks, abandoning his own children for a shot at a billion-dollar lifestyle. But he forgot the golden rule. The truth always has a way of walking through the front door, sometimes wearing a red dress. It's a powerful reminder that you can't build a real future on a fake foundation. In the end, the two women he tried to play against each other found a family in each other, while he ended up with nothing but time. What would you have done if you were Rachel? Would you have taken the $5 million to walk away? Or was justice worth more than the money? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice and karma, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.